On March 15, 2019, Detective Sarah Mitchell received a call that would haunt her for the rest of her career. A wellness check at 847 Ashfield Lane had uncovered something that defied every natural law of family and morality. Inside the modest two-story colonial home, police found not one, but two married couples living under the same roof. Nothing unusual about that, you might think. Except these weren't ordinary couples. Daniel and Rebecca Ashfield were twins who had married another set of twins, Emma and Ethan Caldwell. But that wasn't the disturbing part. After 40 years of living in this arrangement, a single confession during a routine interview would expose a truth so twisted, so carefully concealed, that it would force authorities to question everything they thought they knew about the perfect family next door. What started as a simple welfare check ended with multiple arrests, court orders, and revelations that shook the entire community of Westbridge County to its core. This is their story. Before we dive into this disturbing case, if you're fascinated by true crime and mysterious family secrets, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't believe where this story goes. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end, because the final revelation will leave you speechless. Now, let's begin. The Ashfield family had been fixtures in Westbridge County since 1979. Daniel and Rebecca Ashfield moved into the quiet neighborhood with their spouses, Emma and Ethan Caldwell, shortly after both couples had married in a joint ceremony that the local newspaper had called a beautiful celebration of twin love. Neighbors remembered the event fondly. It wasn't every day that twin brothers married twin sisters in the same ceremony. The four of them seemed inseparable, always hosting neighborhood barbecues, attending church every Sunday, and volunteering at the local community center. Their home at 847 Ashfield Lane was picture perfect. White picket fence, meticulously maintained garden, American flag flying proudly from the front porch. Children in the neighborhood would often ride their bikes past the house, and the Ashfield Caldwell couples would wave from their rocking chairs on the porch. They were the embodiment of the American dream. Two successful marriages, stable jobs, and a home filled with what appeared to be love and laughter. But appearances, as Detective Mitchell would soon discover, can be devastatingly deceptive. The first crack in the facade appeared in early 2019, when Emma Caldwell failed to show up for her weekly book club meeting. Emma had been a member of the Westbridge Ladies Literary Society for over 30 years, and had never missed a meeting without calling ahead. When she didn't answer phone calls or text messages, her book club friends grew concerned. One of them, Margaret Chen, decided to drive by the Ashfield home to check on her friend. What she saw through the front window would set everything in motion. Margaret noticed Emma sitting in the living room, staring blankly at a wall, while Rebecca stood behind her with a hand on her shoulder in what Margaret later described as a controlling grip. Something about the scene felt wrong, though Margaret couldn't quite articulate why. Margaret contacted the non-emergency police line to request a wellness check. Officer James Rodriguez was dispatched to the residence on March 15th at approximately 2 in the afternoon. When he knocked on the door, Daniel Ashfield answered with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel explained that Emma had been feeling under the weather and had simply forgotten to call her friends. Everything was fine, he assured the officer. Perfectly fine. But Officer Rodriguez had been on the force for 15 years, and his instincts told him something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and when Emma appeared in the doorway behind Daniel, she looked at the officer with eyes that seemed to be pleading for help, even as her mouth formed the words, "I'm okay." Officer Rodriguez asked if he could speak with Emma privately, a request that made Daniel's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. After a moment of tense silence, Daniel stepped aside and allowed the officer to enter the home. What Rodriguez saw inside appeared normal at first glance. Clean living room, family photos on the walls, comfortable furniture. But there was something odd about the photos. Every single picture showed all four adults together. There were no individual photos, no pictures of just the two couples separately, and certainly no childhood photos of any of them. It was as if their lives had begun the moment they all came together. Emma agreed to speak with Officer Rodriguez on the front porch, away from the others. She sat down on one of the rocking chairs, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. When Rodriguez asked if everything was all right, Emma's composure began to crumble. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she whispered something that made the officer lean in closer to hear. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep pretending." When Rodriguez asked what she meant, Emma looked back at the front door, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. And then she said the words that would blow the case wide open. "We're not who everyone thinks we are. None of us are." Officer Rodriguez immediately called for backup, and Detective Sarah Mitchell was assigned to the case. When Mitchell arrived at the scene 30 minutes later, all four adults were sitting in the living room, silent and stone-faced. Mitchell had handled countless domestic situations in her 12-year career, but something about this case felt different. The air in the house was thick with secrets, and she could sense that whatever she was about to uncover would be significant. She separated the four adults and began conducting individual interviews. She started with Emma, the one who had first hinted that something was wrong. In a private room with just Detective Mitchell and a female officer present, Emma Caldwell finally broke down completely. Through tears and stammered words, she began to tell a story that Mitchell initially found difficult to believe. Emma explained that she and Ethan were not actually the Caldwell twins. They were not twins at all. In fact, Emma revealed she was Daniel's sister, and Ethan was Rebecca's brother. The couples had fabricated the entire story about two sets of twins marrying each other to hide the truth. Daniel had married his own sister Rebecca, and Emma had married her own brother Ethan. They had been living as two separate couples for appearances, but the reality was far more disturbing. Detective Mitchell felt her stomach turn as Emma continued. The four of them had grown up in an isolated rural community in northern Montana, a place called Riverside Haven that was essentially a religious compound run by a charismatic leader named Pastor Vincent Ashfield, Daniel and Emma's father. In this community, the beliefs were extreme and the rules were absolute. Pastor Vincent preached that bloodline purity was sacred, that keeping family lines unspoiled by outsiders was God's will. Children in the community were homeschooled, had no contact with the outside world, and were taught from birth that marrying within the family was not just acceptable, but holy. Emma explained that when she and Daniel were teenagers, their father had arranged for Daniel to marry Rebecca, who was actually Emma's twin sister, and for Emma to marry Ethan, who was Rebecca's twin brother. But the arrangement was even more twisted than that. The marriages were part of a larger network within Riverside Haven where multiple siblings were married to each other in various configurations, all orchestrated by Pastor Vincent to maintain what he called genetic and spiritual purity. The children born from these unions were considered blessed, chosen by God to carry forward the pure bloodline. As Emma spoke, Detective Mitchell took meticulous notes, her hand steady even as her mind reeled from the revelations. Emma described how she and Daniel, along with Rebecca and Ethan, had decided to leave Riverside Haven in 1979 when they were in their early 20s. They had been among the first to escape the compound, fleeing in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small amount of money they had managed to save. They knew that if they told the truth about their relationships, they would face legal consequences and social ostracism. So they created a new identity for themselves, claiming to be two sets of unrelated twins who had fallen in love. The elaborate deception required careful planning. They obtained fake birth certificates through a forger they met in a truck stop in Nevada, changed their last names, and created an entirely new history for themselves. Daniel and Emma took the last name Ashfield, using their father's name, ironically, as their own. Rebecca and Ethan became the Caldwells, a name they had seen on a tombstone in a cemetery they passed through. They rehearsed their backstory until it became second nature. They moved to Westbridge County, a place far enough from Montana that no one would know them, and started their new lives. For 40 years they maintained the charade. They were careful never to show affection that would reveal the true nature of their relationships in public. Daniel was married to Rebecca on paper, and Emma was married to Ethan. But behind closed doors, the arrangements were different. Emma admitted that the situation had been eating away at her conscience for decades, especially as she had gotten older and begun to question everything she had been taught as a child. She had realized that what they were doing was wrong, that the beliefs instilled in them by Pastor Vincent were not holy but horrific. But by then, she was trapped. They all were. They had built entire lives on a foundation of lies, and admitting the truth would destroy everything. Detective Mitchell asked Emma why she was coming forward now, after all these years. Emma's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I want to die with a clean conscience," she said. "I'm 63 years old and I don't have much time left. I have cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. I can't meet my maker carrying this burden. I need to tell the truth, even if it costs me everything." Emma explained that she had been trying to convince the others to come clean with her, but they had refused. Daniel, Rebecca, and Ethan were terrified of the consequences, afraid of losing their home, their reputations, and possibly facing criminal charges. Mitchell interviewed the other 3 adults separately. Daniel was defiant, insisting that they had done nothing wrong, that they were all consenting adults who had made their choices. He claimed that their relationships were based on love, not coercion, and that society's laws regarding marriage were archaic and discriminatory. Rebecca was more subdued, alternating between defending their choices and expressing regret. She admitted that she had always known their situation was morally questionable, but she had convinced herself that as long as they weren't hurting anyone, it was acceptable. Ethan was the most emotionally distraught of the 3. He broke down during his interview, admitting that he had spent 40 years in agony, knowing that what they were doing was wrong, but feeling powerless to change it. The legal situation was complex. While incestuous marriages are illegal in all 50 states, the statute of limitations and the specific circumstances of their case made prosecution difficult. The marriages had been conducted under false identities, and the 4 individuals had been living as 2 legally married couples for 4 decades. Authorities would need to prove fraud, obtain evidence of the original relationships, and navigate a maze of legal technicalities. Detective Mitchell contacted the FBI to investigate the Riverside Haven compound in Montana, suspecting that if these 4 had escaped, there might be others living in similar situations. What the FBI uncovered was even more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Riverside Haven still existed, though it had changed names several times over the years to avoid scrutiny. Currently operating as the Covenant Family Ministry, the compound was home to approximately 150 people, spanning multiple generations. FBI agents obtained search warrants and raided the property in April 2019. What they found inside was a nightmare of systematic abuse, forced marriages, and exploitation. Pastor Vincent Ashfield had died in 2003, but his son, Marcus Ashfield, had taken over leadership and continued his father's practices. Children as young as 14 were being married to their siblings or cousins in ceremonies that had no legal standing, but were treated as sacred within the community. Women had no rights or autonomy existing solely to bear children and serve their husbands, who were often their own brothers or fathers. Education beyond basic literacy was forbidden. Medical care was prohibited except for childbirth, leading to preventable deaths from treatable conditions. The FBI removed 63 children from the compound, along with 28 women who requested assistance in leaving. The investigation revealed at least 35 incestuous marriages, with some individuals married to multiple siblings simultaneously in polygamous arrangements. Back in Westbridge County, the revelation about the Ashfield Caldwell household sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known them for decades struggled to reconcile the friendly, normal people they thought they knew with the reality of their situation. The media descended on the quiet neighborhood, turning 847 Ashfield Lane into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside the house, demanding interviews. Local news channels ran sensationalized stories with headlines screaming about the incest house and the decades of deception. The four adults became prisoners in their own home, afraid to step outside and face the judgment of the world. The legal proceedings were lengthy and complicated. The district attorney's office debated what charges, if any, could be brought against the four. Ultimately, they were charged with fraud related to the fake marriage licenses and false identification documents. The incest itself was harder to prosecute due to the time that had passed and the consensual nature of the relationships as adults, though prosecutors argued that the conditioning they had received as children in Riverside Haven meant true consent was questionable. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were victims of cult indoctrination, not criminals, and that they deserved compassion rather than punishment. During the trial, which began in September 2019, more details emerged about life in Riverside Haven. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of growing up in such an environment, explaining how cult indoctrination works and why victims often struggle to leave, even when they recognize the abuse. Former members of the compound who had escaped over the years came forward to share their stories, painting a picture of a community built on control, fear, and twisted religious doctrine. Many of these witnesses described similar situations to the Ashfield Caldwell arrangement, revealing that the practice of siblings marrying each other was not an isolated incident, but a systematic pattern within the compound. Emma's health deteriorated rapidly during the trial. She appeared in court in a wheelchair, frail and weak, her cancer advancing aggressively. Her testimony was the most compelling of the trial. She spoke clearly and without self-pity, taking full responsibility for her choices while also explaining the context in which those choices were made. She described the fear and confusion of being a child in Riverside Haven, the absolute authority that Pastor Vincent held over every aspect of their lives, and the genuine belief they all had that they were following God's will. She also spoke about the 40 years of living with guilt and shame, the constant fear of discovery, and the toll it had taken on all of them. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they returned a mixed verdict. All four defendants were found guilty of fraud related to their false identities and marriage licenses. However, the jury recommended leniency in sentencing, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of their upbringing. The judge sentenced each of them to 5 years probation, community service, and mandatory psychological counseling. The marriages were annulled, and they were prohibited from living together. Daniel and Emma moved to separate apartments in different parts of the county. Rebecca entered a long-term care facility, having developed early-onset dementia during the stress of the trial. Ethan moved to Oregon to live with a cousin he had reconnected with after the case became public. Emma Caldwell died on December 8, 2019, just 3 months after the trial concluded. Her death certificate listed cancer as the cause, but those who knew her story understood that she had been dying long before the disease took hold, slowly suffocating under the weight of secrets and lies. In her final days, she told Detective Mitchell that despite everything that had happened, she felt free for the first time in her life. She had told the truth, faced the consequences, and unburdened her soul. Mitchell attended Emma's funeral, a small service attended by only a handful of people. As she stood by the grave, Mitchell reflected on the complexity of the case, the thin line between victim and perpetrator, and the lasting damage that cults and extreme ideologies inflict on vulnerable people. The investigation into Riverside Haven and the Covenant Family Ministry continued for years. Marcus Ashfield was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, fraud, and running an illegal marriage scheme. He was convicted in 2021 and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Many of the children removed from the compound were placed in foster care, or with relatives who had left the community years earlier. Deprogramming and reintegrating these children into normal society proved challenging. They had been taught that the outside world was evil, that government was satanic, and that any deviation from Pastor Vincent's teachings would result in eternal damnation. Therapists and social workers spent years helping them understand that they had been victims of abuse, not blessed recipients of divine truth. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the existence of isolated religious communities in America, and the difficulty of detecting abuse when it occurs behind closed doors in the name of faith. Legislators in several states introduced bills to strengthen oversight of homeschooling and religious organizations, though these efforts faced significant opposition from religious freedom advocates who argued that government interference in family matters and religious practice was a dangerous overreach. The debate continues to this day, with no easy answers or solutions. For the people of Westbridge County, the Ashfield case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of keeping secrets and the impossibility of truly knowing the people around us. The house at 847 Ashfield Lane stood empty for 2 years before finally being sold to a young family who had no connection to the area and were unaware of its history. Neighbors reported seeing lights on in the house late at night and children playing in the yard, normal sounds of family life that stood in stark contrast to the decades of hidden trauma that had occurred within those walls. Detective Sarah Mitchell retired from the police force in 2022, but the Ashfield case remained one of the defining investigations of her career. In interviews, she often spoke about the complexity of the case, the difficulty of determining right from wrong when dealing with people who had been victimized themselves before becoming perpetrators of deception. She emphasized that while the 4 adults had made choices that were legally and morally wrong, they were also products of extreme abuse and manipulation. Understanding the full context didn't excuse their actions, but it did provide insight into how such situations develop and persist. The broader investigation into similar compounds across the United States revealed a disturbing pattern. The FBI identified at least 12 other isolated religious communities where incestuous relationships were practiced, though most were less organized and systematic than Riverside Haven. Many of these communities operated under the radar for decades, protected by laws designed to safeguard religious freedom and parental rights. The challenge for law enforcement was finding the balance between respecting those freedoms and protecting vulnerable individuals, particularly children, from abuse. As of 2024, Daniel Ashfield is 71 years old and lives alone in a small apartment in Westbridge County. He rarely leaves his home and has no contact with his former family members. In a rare interview with a local journalist in 2023, he expressed regret for the deception, but maintained that he had done what he believed was necessary to survive and build a life outside the compound. He acknowledged that he had been wrong, but struggled to fully accept the extent of the damage caused by his actions and those of his father. Ethan Caldwell found some measure of peace in Oregon, reconnecting with extended family members who had left Riverside Haven before he was born. He has been active in support groups for cult survivors and has spoken publicly about his experiences, hoping to help others who are trying to escape similar situations. In his talks, he emphasizes that leaving a cult is just the beginning of the journey, that the real work is unlearning the beliefs and behaviors that were instilled from childhood. Rebecca Ashfield's dementia progressed rapidly after the trial. By 2021, she no longer recognized anyone and had no memory of the trial, the compound, or her life in Westbridge County. In a cruel irony, her disease erased the very memories that had tormented her for so long. She died in 2023 in a nursing home, her passing barely noted beyond a brief obituary in the local paper. The children who were removed from the Covenant Family Ministry have had varying degrees of success in adjusting to life outside the compound. Some have thrived, completing their education, finding careers, and building healthy relationships. Others have struggled with depression, anxiety, and difficulty trusting authority figures. A few have even attempted to return to the compound, or have sought to recreate similar communities, unable to fully break free from the indoctrination of their childhood. Social workers and therapists working with these survivors note that recovery is not a linear process, and that the impact of cult involvement can last a lifetime. The Ashfield case also raised important questions about the definition of family and the limits of personal autonomy. While most people find incestuous relationships inherently wrong, the case forced society to grapple with uncomfortable questions about consent, free will, and the lasting impact of childhood trauma. If adults who were raised in a cult truly believe they are doing nothing wrong, can they be held fully accountable for their actions? How do we balance compassion for victims with the need to enforce laws and protect others? These questions have no simple answers, and the Ashfield case continues to be studied in law schools and psychology programs as an example of the complexity of human behavior and morality. In the end, the story of the Ashfield family is not just about incest or deception. It is about the power of indoctrination, the difficulty of breaking free from the beliefs instilled in childhood, and the lasting damage that abuse inflicts across generations. It is about 4 people who were victimized as children, who made terrible choices as adults, and who ultimately paid a heavy price for those choices. It is about a community that looked the other way for decades, content to believe that the nice couples next door were exactly what they appeared to be, unwilling to ask uncomfortable questions or look beneath the surface. The case serves as a reminder that evil often wears a pleasant face, that the most disturbing secrets can hide behind white picket fences and friendly waves from the porch. It reminds us that the people we think we know best may be strangers, carrying burdens and secrets we cannot imagine. And it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes there are no heroes or villains, only damaged people trying to survive in a world that was never designed to accommodate their particular form of suffering. Detective Mitchell summed it up best in her final report on the case. She wrote, "The Ashfield investigation revealed not just the crimes of 4 individuals, but the systemic failure of society to protect vulnerable children from abuse disguised as religion. We found not monsters, but broken people who had been twisted by forces beyond their control. Justice in this case could never be clean or satisfying because the true perpetrator, Pastor Vincent Ashfield, was long dead, beyond the reach of earthly punishment. We did what we could with what we had, but I cannot help feeling that everyone involved in this case lost something essential, something that can never be recovered. The house at 847 Ashfield Lane stands today as it always has, a modest colonial home with a white picket fence, its dark history known only to those who remember. The new family living there has no idea of the secrets that once festered within those walls, and perhaps that is for the best. Life goes on, children play in the yard, and the neighborhood has returned to its quiet routine. But for those who were touched by the Ashfield case, the scars remain, a permanent reminder of the price of secrets and the impossibility of truly escaping the past.